Okay, if everyone could take their seats. We'd like to get started here. So this session is this is the other most important session. It's on the endangerment finding. And the endangerment finding is the root of all global warming evil at the EPA. And we are trying to figure out here what is the best way to get that thing reconsidered and undone, because it's not all that clear that the current administration views this with the urgency that we do. So we have a great panel. We're going to lead off with David Schnare, PhD, scientist, lawyer, EPA employee for 30 years. Has been involved in a lot of EPA litigation. We have Rick Belzer, another PhD in public policy from Harvard. I've known Rick for a very, very long time. He was an economist at OMB, looking at rules, giving the thumbs up, thumbs down on rules. And Harry MacDonald, a lawyer from Atlanta who's been involved in the Clean Power Plan litigation. So, David?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Heartland, for this whole session. I'm delighted that there's so many people left in the room. It's late in the day, and usually this is when I take my nap, so if I drop off, you'll understand why. Let's see, I get to look down there and see what I'm actually talking about. All right, endangerment finding. What is this all about? Well, the interesting issue and thought here, I have to come clean in the first place. I think this is a great visual. You see all that pollution. As Anthony Scalia made the point, as a matter of law, anything in the air is pollution, including a Frisbee. And so if you look at that picture I had, or you look at the one on the left here, that's just water vapor. If you want to see real pollution, the one on the right is purely pollution. That, of course, is the papal smokestack. And from all the comments that we've heard from the Pope, I'm not sure why they don't have something controlling that. What I want to make, and I'll make my point early on, is that this endangerment finding can only be reconsidered if it begins with reconsidering the science itself. Until the science is redone, there is no way to move past whether or not this stuff endangers human health and welfare. And as you'll find, the science demonstrates that a change in climate physics and phenomena have to be outside, this is the science in me talking, outside the normal variation that we see in climate. And yet, people never talk about that. They talk about little bitty changes, much like the last panel, little bitty changes that someone can claim are associated therewith. And this is a critical element of the science that's got to be looked at. And then I think what's really important here, most people don't grasp, this is sort of inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C. speak. The major studies on which EPA relied are either the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report or the National Research Council's report from NAS, or the piece that came out essentially out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And it's OSTP that put out the piece, in essence, just last Friday, that is an alarmist view of the whole problem, and it represents what the last president had to say and his administration, because this president has yet to get somebody into OSTP to get their hands around the bad science. And so if you have that report sitting out there, and then Scott Pruitt decides he's going to put a bunch of people in a room and come up with a different report, now you have competing reports. And that is not how you run a train. And so if this is going to be done, if you're going to reconsider the science to reconsider the endangerment finding, you've got to bring these two together somehow. Well, let's talk about the authority to make an endangerment finding. The way this works is it's just because there's a pollutant doesn't mean it's necessarily dangerous. There's all kinds of pollutants. The Frisbees are, of course, dangerous if you've had too many beers and you're out on your dorm front lawn and you're throwing it to the other guy. It'll hit somebody in the face, and that's dangerous. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be controlled under the Clean Air Act. It has to be something that harms human health or welfare, and there isn't just one such finding. These findings are done multiple times by the agency. Now, having made these, and let me just clarify that. You take a pollutant, let's say greenhouse gases, and you say greenhouse gases cause problems which endanger human health and welfare. Then you go in and you say, okay, automobiles produce carbon dioxide, and therefore that industry causes or contributes to endangerment of health and welfare. Coal-fired power plants, natural gas-fired power plants, airplanes. The list can be as long as you wish to make it. I'm waiting for them to come out and say Republican voters exist and are a primary cause of air pollution from CO2 and therefore should be regulated. In any case, what's important is once you make an endangerment finding, the law requires, it doesn't offer you the opportunity, it mandates certain actions. And I know this is going to be hard to read, and I don't intend for you to necessarily read it here, but I just want to go over it to show you the significance of all that's there. Under 108, if you find that it causes or contributes to air pollution, you have to publish what's called a NAAQS, a National Ambient Air Quality Standard. Well, EPA hasn't done that. But if I'm an environmental crazy and I want to do something, I'm going to go to court tomorrow while there's still an endangerment finding in place and sue EPA for not having put in a NAAQS. And then EPA would be forced to write a National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And having had that standard in place, it means all the states have to come up with state implementation plans on how to reduce their carbon dioxide or their greenhouse gases. Then we have stationary sources. And this is where the Clean Power Plan comes in, 111B and D. And when we find that an industry that's a stationary source is a problem, then they have to regulate that. Then 202 is, and this is where the agency began, by the way, motor vehicles. So if we find that the greenhouse gases endanger human health or welfare, we have to regulate CO2 from these vehicles. And then you've got, and I love this one because it is one of the two that is incredibly sweeping. No one's used it yet, and if someone would pay me a lot of money, I mean a lot of money, I would sue EPA to make them do this because I could get a lot of money. But international air pollution, if it's found that emissions that are a pollutant that endangers human health and welfare in some other country, under those conditions, the states are required to put into their state implementation plans controls over that pollutant. And they could do that tomorrow. I mean, you could just go, boom, I want to see CO2 reduction in every state implementation plan. How are you going to shut down your coal-fired power plants? How are you going to go to pure electric vehicles? How are you going to kill your cow herds and the like? So those are just four. We're not done yet. We got aircraft, and they're working on that one. We got tank vessels, which are ships that carry a lot of fuels, and you actually do get some emissions, significant emissions from some of these. They're not CO2, they're volatile organic kinds of things. And then there's the stratosphere one, and I just love this one because if you have anything that, quote, may reasonably be anticipated to affect the stratosphere, well then you've got to control these substances, practices, processes, or activities. Well, gosh, that is such a broad mandate. You could do anything you wanted under that mandate, under the Section 615. This is where the ozone controls and the worry about the ozone hole came out from. That's why this section was put in place. But the language is so amorphous that anyone can interpret it any way they want. And who interprets the law? Well, okay, if it's ambiguous, the agency gets to decide, and under this administration they would argue vehemently that somehow or another this doesn't apply. But the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals would be the ones that have the final say on that, And I assure you that you can't find an adequate number of them who are going to be able to come back in and say, no, it's okay, you don't have to do anything. So this is why the endangerment finding has to be redone. Because if it isn't redone, someone's going to come in, sue the agency, and make them regulate, no matter who's sitting in the White House trying to tweet. And so when you look at that, I just want to go back on the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment. This is the finding that people probably most want to look at. And if you can knock out the core endangerment finding itself, the one that says that greenhouse gases endanger both public health and public welfare for current and future generations, you pretty much clean the deck. Because this is the one on which all the others, not only the other endangerment findings, but the other regulations rely. And then you've got the other ones is not that it's endangerment, it's cause or contribute significantly to the emissions. And so that endangerment finding goes away if you've already decided that whatever you're looking at doesn't really endanger human health and welfare. But it's conceivable that you could say, yeah, it causes a problem, but it's not significant. It's not a significant source. It's sort of a second-hand way to get at this. I don't know that anybody is clever enough at the agency right now to sort of tease out this, and I don't think that they want to go down that road either, but it is possible. Well, as I said, there's really only one that matters, and that's the greenhouse gases endanger human health and the welfare, and you've just got to address that. And so how does it make this finding? Well, as I said, they rely primarily on major assessments by the Global Warming Group, the USGCRP, and the IPCC, and the NRC, and the National Academies. And so what has to be done for the science is for the Office of Science and Technology Policy to rewrite the climate science special report. And doing it that way, you get a report that's clean, fresh, has all the honest science in it, and deals with it. The question comes up, can EPA just do a red team, blue team thing on its own? Well, yeah, they could. But as I mentioned, if you've got the OSTP report sitting over here, and they're the president's science people, and you got EPA over here, and they're not together, you have a problem. It's a big problem. And it will be used as a wedge on the debate. So you're only going to get EPA to be successful if they do it in full coordination with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. You must address each of the lines of evidence that EPA took up. That's a legal issue. You've got to simply deal with each of the arguments that were made. And for those of you who've been following this issue, that's really not that difficult. And you have to do it in a manner that provides for notice and comment by the public. And there is a suggestion that EPA is going to try to go down this route and have a red team, blue team as part of a notice and comment on a proposed reconsideration of something, I don't know what, probably a rule. So it's conceivable, but still, you got to get OSTP involved. The foundational questions in terms of human health and welfare have really to do with only two things. The global temperature, which people admit, the scientists that I've heard this week, say that's not a very good measure at all, surface temperature, but that's what EPA relied on, and the ocean pH. Now, let me just give you a couple of quick items. The argument is that if you increase human-caused greenhouse gases, then you must have an increase in the temperature. And the increase has to be in both the low temperatures and the high temperatures measured each day. You see, we typically use an average temperature. Well, we know the low temperatures are affected by the urban heat island effect and the like. And so if we just throw out the crap that's in the low temperatures and just look at the high temperatures and say, have the high temperatures gone up? Because if this is a problem, they should have. Well, here are the average daily maximum temperatures at all the stations that are followed. And you'll notice over the last nearly 100 years, they aren't going up. And I like this one even better. What percentage of these weather stations recorded summer days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. It's been going down. It ought to be going up. And it's this kind of information that is compelling and I think we can show is important. I want to take just a second with this graph. It's a bit confusing, but it has to do with ocean pH. The blue lines, the blue dots at the bottom is CO2. And you'll notice that as you get to the right-hand side, it goes flying upward. Now, keep in mind the scale here. We're talking about thousands of years here, so we're really just looking at the far right-hand side. The green is the actual ocean pH that we know of in the South China Sea. And the red dots are pH in Flinders, which is not very far away, but it's still out in the Pacific. Let me close up on that. And you'll notice that this pH that we find is a very broad band. It's all over the map. And just to give you an idea, look at the green line. The currently measured numbers are no different than we've seen for 6,000, 7,000 years. And so, once again, if you're going to have a problem and it's pH, well, you should be able to see it. Well, I don't think you can see it. And so I would just leave with Nikola Tesla and Isaac Asimov, two very good scientists. A lot of people don't realize how good a scientist Asimov was because he's a science fiction writer. But basically, the saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom, and that's the challenge that we're in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. That was terrific. Rick, Dr. Rick Belzer.
Green is forward, is it?
Yeah.
Does this turn you off? The red button. That's right. Thank you. I appreciate Steve mentioning that I earned my degree at Harvard. He's trying to embarrass me. He didn't mention that I've been a Dodgers fan since 1959. And let me just say that if it had been best 5 out of 9, we would have won. In 2009, novelist Tom Wolfe in an interview said, an intellectual is a person who is knowledgeable in one field but speaks out only in others. I'm going to try not to be an intellectual. I feel a little bit like Robin Williams doing Aladdin here. These are not intended to be disclaimers so much as make sure you understand the limitations here. I am not sufficiently expert in climate change, global warming, whatever your current terminology is for it. I am an expert in information quality. And it's a set of principles that are very important for the climate change debate. And I should add that even if, as some of you believe, the climate change debate is really a matter of theology and not science, then the principles of information quality would still play a key role in that debate. So I'm going to give you a cliff notes. I hope that's not a trademark violation. If it is, I'm going to assume it's fair use. Actually, the history of information quality began in the late 1990s. When EPA set the first national ambient air quality standards for PM 2.5. As many of you have heard, maybe not everyone, EPA relied on inferences and opinions of researchers who refused to disclose their data that was the basis for their analyses and their opinions. All efforts to force public disclosure of the data failed, and ultimately the real reasons that EPA had no legal obligation to show its work. The information quality paradigm changes that, and it requires the agencies to show their work, provided that the public is willing to hold them accountable. So there are a lot of problems in the way EPA and other agencies have implemented their responsibilities since 2002. Many of the requests for correction have been badly done. Some of them have targeted the wrong things. For example, a lot of requests for correction target policy. There are really disputes about policy, and policy is not covered by information quality, because policy is not information. And there's been litigation that has been unsuccessful for a number of reasons that we could get to over an adult beverage later. Here's the 4 principles for information quality. Transparency is a procedural step. It's confirmed by the capability to reproduce results that the agency has prepared, using the same information the agency used. The other 3 are substantive criteria, integrity, we'll go into just a second. OMB wrote guidelines, and each agency had to implement its own, write its own separate guidelines, and EPA did that. The OMB guidelines require agencies to do what was called pre-dissemination review to prevent the dissemination of information that was erroneous. But it also required agencies to establish an error correction process to enable the public to seek and obtain the correction of error for errors that are disseminated despite those pre-dissemination review provisions. Well, I'm going to focus, here are the kind of definitions briefly, but I'm going to focus on information. As you see, the terminology, any communication or representation of knowledge, such as facts or data, in any medium or form, it is difficult to craft a definition that's broader than that. There are things that are exempt, however, and it doesn't cover policy judgments, it doesn't cover opinions, except when information about opinions is then disseminated. That's a pretty complicated thing. And to correct something that came up in an earlier session, testimony by agency officials to Congress is exempt. And there's some good reasons for that. You can only imagine how many complaints there would be if all testimony had to be subject to basically peer review before it was delivered. Now, the other thing that's key is that when an agency converts a policy question into a scientific issue, what I call the scientization of policy, by doing so, it has brought it under the aegis of information quality. Because if the agency is going to say that it's science, then by God, it's going to have to defend it as science. So that's a very useful aspect of it. So a lot of things that look like values and judgments are being conveyed as science in order for agency scientists to be able to define them, decide them. That makes it subject to information quality. Objectivity comes in 2 flavors, substantive, and that's the kind of thing you normally think about. Presentational objectivity is basically the context. In his 1984 book on exegetical fallacies in Christian preaching, Professor D.A. Carson at a Trinity Evangelical Divinity School had a really nice way of explaining this in the case of theology. And as I mentioned before, that may apply here. He said, a text without a context is a pretext. And that happens a lot in agency dissemination of information. On Friday, I think it is, Steve Koonin wrote about the Climate Science Special Report, a number of complaints about the report. And if you read through that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, what he's really saying, but doesn't understand the background, is that these are presentational objectivity problems in the report. That he's already basically saying the report is a fair target for information quality error correction petitions. And that sounds, I have not read the report, but it sounds reasonable to me because of the frequency with which I see these problems. Now, when OMB directed agencies to write their own guidelines, they had to be consistent with OMB's. A lot of them cheated on that. But when push comes to shove, OMB's guidelines supersede. They had the authority to issue this as a rule and not as guidance. They didn't do so. That said, it's never too late, and they could do it tomorrow. And if they did so, they could also create a positive right of action for the public in federal court. It's nothing stopping them from doing that if that's what they want to do. And I think that's would be a very useful line to proceed. For climate change matters, one of the challenges is that responsible agency can be difficult to ascertain. An agency A may disseminate information that was produced by agency B and say, well, we're not responsible, go look at agency B for the information. It can be challenging, but it's workable. There are also non-agency disseminations like the Global Climate Change Program. That's not a formal agency, so who's responsible for it? There's a lot of finger pointing going on. Third-party information is also subject, as long as an agency disseminates it, as in a way that would convey to a reasonable reader that it embraces it or endorses it. So that is anything the agency would disseminate can be brought under this system. This is a schematic diagram of the process for an error correction request. Everything you see in red is what you as a petitioner would do. That part which is in blue are kind of the decision points. And my paper is a different color, so I hope, yeah, it's blue. Those would be decision points. You have to decide if you're going to appeal, you're going to try to go to court. The green parts are the parts the agency has to do. And every agency's guidelines have deadlines in them. And so there's a lot that can be done there. I realize that agencies have not been compliant in the past. I do think our situation is different now. And I would also say that there are ways of making the agency violations more publicly known. Now, if you apply it to the endangerment finding, you should keep in mind that information is covered, policy choices are not. Don't try to use this to attack policy choices. You're using it to deal with information. But so much of the statutory language for endangerment has this mixed bag of policy and science. So cause or contribute can be an opinion, or it could be a statement of probabilities. You have to think about hard how to go about that. And among the policy issues that cannot be challenged using information quality would be the appropriate degree of risk aversion that an agency head ought to display. Now, I think part of the answer to this is to include the benefits of climate change into the calculation. Certainly, if everything is bad, then there's only a question of degree. But I think that these things are much more complicated than that. What we have to do is to fractionate the science from this blend so that what's left behind are the murky still bottoms of policy. Leave that alone and stick to the science. Petitions are under the Administrative Procedure Act, as Harry's going to talk about. Well, those are legal documents. They're not scientific documents, and they have to cover scientific issues, but they're ultimately not scientific documents. And I really don't think you want judges basically making scientific decisions. So what information quality does is it provides a procedure whereby you can convert a scientific issue into a process issue that judges can understand. That is the key to making it successful. And so I would say that it would have been better to prosecute the scientific questions first before filing petitions. That said, as long as EPA doesn't act on them, or whatever agency has to act on them, it's never too late to build the scientific record of error. And I would encourage you all to do it very soon. But remember, the proper goal here is not to change the policy, it's to correct the science. And there's another set of issues involved in third-party information, particularly that which has been peer-reviewed. There are a lot of ways to challenge it. There is a rebuttable presumption in the guidelines for peer-reviewed information, because peer review is sort of the weak standard for pre-dissemination review. But a lot of peer reviews don't deal with information quality. And in fact, what I really mean by saying a lot is that all of them do not deal with information quality. I just completed a 2-year term on the Science Advisory Board Committee, and nowhere in the charge was anything about information quality. But amazingly, I put it in because there isn't any constraint on SAB members from adding to the charge. So there you go. These things have to be challenged because agencies will hide behind third-party information if they can do so. But in the case of the data that haven't been disclosed, remember I said that the first order of business is transparency, such that a qualified third party could reproduce the results. Well, if the data aren't disclosed, that's simply impossible, and you're done. You've already shown a fatal violation of information quality. That's pretty much all I have to say. I'll respond to questions if I can hear them. I am significantly hearing impaired, and there will be two kinds of questions that you will give me, those which I can hear and those I don't want to answer, and those I will not be able to hear.
Thank you, Rick. That was great. Harry MacDonald.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be with you. The reason I'm here is that me and a lawyer from New York City named Buddy Minton filed a petition to reconsider the endangerment finding on science grounds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to start off talking about the scope and importance of the endangerment finding, which will be abbreviated because David has covered that so effectively already. Then I'm going to describe the arguments that we set out in our petition and why they are what they are, and then a little bit further about the red team, blue team. Sort of the question posed on this panel is whether President Trump can execute his America First energy policy without getting rid of the endangerment finding. I think the answer is only in part at best. The endangerment finding will hamstring the full exploitation of fossil fuels because, as David pointed out, the existence of the endangerment finding absolutely compels the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. It's the basis for all regulation of mobile sources. It's the basis for the aircraft greenhouse gas rule. It's the basis for regulating methane emissions. It's the basis for regulating nautical vehicle emissions. It's the basis for stationary source regulation of new sources and existing sources. There is an argument that EPA failed to carry out a new and required endangerment finding under Section 111. I have no idea how that might come out. Pipelines, coal mines, natural gas export facilities, power plants, industrial plants, highways, coal terminals, basically every node of the industrial economy is subject to regulation for the sake of fixing the weather. The endangerment finding will continue to drive greenhouse gas regulation indefinitely unless and until it is rescinded administratively or repealed legislatively, the latter being very, very unlikely. The idea or concept of regulating CO2 emissions to regulate the climate is a concept that knows virtually no bounds. CO2 is ubiquitous to plant, animal, and human life, and so the grant of regulatory authority to the government over CO2 emissions equates to regulatory authority over all of human activity, subject only to the limitations that are in the statute itself or in the Constitution. And the only people that enforce those limitations are 5 members of the Supreme Court. And it is very difficult to get your case up there. But they have twice held that EPA exceeded those bounds. But if you want to know where to stop CO2 regulation in the quest to fix the weather, and you're turning the CO2 climate control knob, and you want to know what the correct setting is, there is no answer. EPA has not supplied one. The court did not require them to set a standard. So there's no level of concentration. There's no global average surface temperature at which you can say, at last, we've averted disaster. So there's no metric. There's no standard you can look to say this much is enough. So on its own terms, CO2 regulation can never end and has no place to stop. So I've described it as a self-issued writ of limitless regulatory authority. And obviously, there is no amount of regulation that will ever fix the weather. Folks used to say, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And now they say, we're from the government. We're here to help. But even if they're right in every particular, none of these regulations could ever possibly make enough difference that you could even detect it. You can calculate a proposed temperature change, but in every case, it is below the threshold of detection in global average surface temperature. So even if they're right, no one will ever know if any of this colossal expenditure did any good. It is totally symbolic and a totally empty gesture that costs billions, if not trillions of dollars, beyond which it is even, in fact, destructive to human health and welfare, as has been so persuasively demonstrated at this conference. So if you're an environmentalist and you look at that picture and you say, what's not to like? It's a monument to regulatory onanism. We do not know exactly what Scott Pruitt intends to do with the endangerment finding. We know he's been reluctant to take on reconsideration, and we don't see any signals that they're planning to get rid of it. The environmental groups will be very happy to go to court with the endangerment finding still in place. Whatever EPA proposes, it will be attacked as not being enough. Their position will be that our totally empty and totally symbolic gestures should cost trillions of dollars instead of merely hundreds of billions. So even if Mr. Pruitt gets all of the technical procedural hurdles exactly right, he will be hamstrung as long as the endangerment finding is still in place. And when he is challenged, he'll have to go to the D.C. Circuit, which has been packed with Obama appointees, who will then be deciding if we're fixing the weather with sufficient vigor. So the Trump administration will lose a lot of those cases in the D.C. Circuit. The reluctance to take on the science arguments stems, I think, from some level of intimidation on the subject, where they don't understand how strong the arguments really are. Pruitt seems to be one of those people, or to be taking counsel from people who believe that. We are doing our best to help him understand that the science arguments are in fact very strong. So this slide here, which I'm finally now getting to, is the history of the endangerment finding. The original petition for rulemaking was filed by Massachusetts and environmental groups in 1999. It was denied by the Bush administration in 2003. That denial was upheld in a very closely divided D.C. Circuit opinion in 2005. It went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled in 2007 and reversed and said, EPA, number one, you do have authority to make this decision, and number two, you have to make a decision one way or the other and comply with the statute when you do it. None of the reasons you've given are good enough. So the endangerment finding was finally issued on December the 7th of 2009, a date which will live in infamy. And then that was upheld. I don't have on this chart. It was upheld by the D.C. Circuit in Coalition for Responsible Regulation versus EPA. I argued the issue in that case, and I got clobbered. And now we have a regulatory tsunami. So our petition is on behalf of a group called the Concerned Household Electricity Consumers Council. If you want to join, you're welcome to join. There are no dues and no duties and no responsibilities other than we put your name on our papers. Our entire effort on the petition is pro bono. My co-counsel is Buddy Minton from New York City, formerly of Wilkie Farr. He has a fantastic blog called the Manhattan Contrarian. CEI and SEP also filed a petition for reconsideration based on science arguments, and the Texas Public Policy Foundation has a law-based petition. And They, as you know, Kathleen Hartnett-White has been nominated to be the head of the Council on Environmental Quality. So if you're trying to pick the winner in this horse race, you might want to put your money on them. But at the moment, these are the only three vehicles for reconsidering the endangerment finding. We're the only game in town. But if somebody else wants to file a petition, you are welcome to do so. I can give you Scott Pruitt's address. Or if you want to write a letter supporting one of these petitions and point out supportive evidence, you're certainly welcome to do that. So our petition and our argument are focused on the attribution analysis that are set out in the EPA's endangerment finding. And they are the three lines of evidence. They're explicitly set out in the Federal Register, and these are what they are: the physical or theoretical understanding of climate, temperature records, and climate models. They are also relied upon explicitly in the aircraft endangerment finding, and they're also set out explicitly in the 2014 National Climate Assessment. The document that came out last Friday does not express the attribution analysis with anywhere near this clarity. They do not specify the same three lines of evidence, which is kind of an odd development. But the utility of this explicit statement is that it's a goalpost that cannot be moved. That's where they've planted the flag, and that's the hill they picked to die on. So if you kill the three lines of evidence, you have killed the endangerment finding. So our petition and two supplements that we have filed go right at these three lines of evidence. On the physical understanding of climate, there's no tropical hotspot shown in millions of balloon measurements going back to 1958 or 59, and then satellite measurements going back to 1979 that falsifies the theory and invalidates the physical understanding line. Temperature records, there's no reason to believe that we are outside the boundaries of natural variability. The temperatures that we have seen can be explained by natural variability. Computer models can be invalidated on a host of grounds, but most fundamentally, they all show the hot spot, which does not exist in nature. They fail the explicit criteria for their use and attribution. And that is also set out in document after document after document. And if the models fail those criteria, they cannot be used logically in attribution. And how could such a model satisfy a HISA requirement? I have no earthly idea. So the three lines of evidence have all been invalidated by a superabundance of empirical data and research analysis. Well, the environmentalists have written, there have been several news articles about our case, our petition, and they never betray any understanding whatsoever of our argument. And they never call us up and ask about it. They call David Doniger. And this is David Doniger's take on our chances. According to them, the endangerment finding is rock solid. It's not. Our argument goes at these three lines of evidence. It's easy to remember, it's easy to understand, and it's easy to explain. It can be stated in 30 seconds, or you could conduct a trial for a month with that architecture. There is a ton of work that's been done that undermines these three lines of evidence. Ross McKittrick, who was here earlier today, has written papers that go at each one of these three. So our petition need not be limited to the papers that we have cited, but can be supported by a great large number. The other side has testified to the importance of this analysis, of the attribution analysis, because they've engaged in a years-long pattern of fraudulent misconduct around attribution, erasing the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, the warming of the 30s, the cooling from the 40s to the 70s, and on and on and on. All of that fraud around the attribution issue, which tells you that's the right place to attack. And if you cut off the causal chain, look at all the things that are no longer caused by human emissions. So if you want to keep you don't need to worry about your coffee, beer, or your sex life, because we're not causing any of that stuff to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Okay, it's Q&A time. Let's try to keep questions short and answers short so we can get more give and take. Right there in the back.
My name is Bob Enlick. I'm a meteorologist with a geology background. My question is, how did this Massachusetts versus the EPA, which claimed that human fossil fuel emissions change sea level rise, get to drive the boat? Because if you look at the data, there has been no acceleration of sea level rise since we put tide gauges in the 1850s. How could this have happened?
There's a very simple, is this on? Yeah, there's a very simple answer to that, and only a lawyer would appreciate the answer. Everyone else will just shake their heads. The United States government, who is defending the position, did not argue whether or not these physical events were happening. And therefore, the court assumed that they were correct, which is why, by the way, if the case had been brought by Colorado, Colorado would have lost because last time I checked, it's not next to an ocean anywhere. But that's how some of these cases go. You start with a factual base that nobody argues about, and you argue the law. And so the factual base was simply an error, but nobody argued it. And hence, that's where they came out.
And then Charles.
Why not sue the EPA because reducing CO2 will harm all life on Earth? Everybody on Earth has cause.
We're going to do that.
There you go. Here's your answer.
It won't be everybody on Earth, but I think we're going to get a farm. Well, I think we're going to look at specific farmers, large farmers who are harmed by reductions in CO2, and I think that's where we'll go.
Well, foresters, farmers,
Yep,
anybody that grows anything,
yep,
or eats anything that somebody grows.
yep.
It's pretty much everybody.
Charles, I think that was half of the two questions, which was if the regulations in being followed cause harm, which the regulation was put in place to prevent, that would seem to be a nice conundrum, which I think has been answered, or being answered.
Yeah.
The other question was, who came up, or is it possible to say, how did the wording, which David, you showed there, of that Clean Air Act get to be so all-encompassing? That must have gone through a number of hands, committees, and whatnot. Who allowed such language to become law? Thank you.
There's a simple answer to that, and it's also one of those inside the Beltway things that we don't talk about too often. In essence, the Clean Air Act takes roughly 10 years to amend. It took about 10 years to pass in the first place. And the only way you can get a law like that passed is to have ambiguous language in it and leave it to the agency to fill the gaps. And so that's how they write. And it's not just the Clean Air Act. You can see it in the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Comprehensive, what's CERCLA, whatever the heck that is, the Superfund Act.
Emergency response.
I mean, and it's not just in environmental. You'll find it across every area in which you'll find statutory language. Except tax law. Well, except tax law and some criminal law.
The perversity to which you refer, regulations designed to protect human health and welfare actually jeopardize it. That falls into the category of agency scientific determinations. So when they adopted the endangerment finding in 2009, and those findings were challenged in court, the judicial standard of review for an agency scientific determination is extreme deference, which is to say, oh, that's going to give me a headache. I cannot be bothered trying to figure out the simple logic of this proposition at the same time that they're deciphering unbelievably complex statutes. So
what they have to have, what the agency has to have to succeed is, quote, a reasonable basis, not just a specific reasonable basis, any reasonable basis.
So if he got a stack of papers on this side and a stack of papers on this side, they can go either way and the court won't touch it.
I want to add, though, that information quality is a tool for undermining that deference. It's a way of building the record that the agency is in error, and that record is not otherwise present because the agency otherwise controls the record.
Yep. The classic is to show that the agency is arbitrary and capricious. There's about 12 ways to show that, but the classic is they had information before them that they did not consider, which is why, as my good friend from Virginia points out, we need to get all this stuff into the record so that if someone doesn't look at it, we can go back in and go, you didn't look at this. And the court, all the court will do, of course, is just take it and hand it back to the agency, say, consider this. Under this administration, that'd be okay. Under other administrations, they just blow us off.
David's good friend from Virginia.
Yeah, the guy that lost the election. The endangerment finding is set up as a tiered response. If they can't find harm from CO2, then you can look for methane. You can't find methane as a problem, then find nitrous oxide. So my question is to you gurus, do we have to take down every molecule of a greenhouse gas, or is it enough to take on the upper level, say, yeah, none of that works because of the lines of evidence? Because every molecule of methane is an issue, be it from bovine flatulence or wetlands.
So remember that the policy is not the thing that you need to deal with. The question is information. And so information an agency relies upon, and if it makes a factual claim, or what is putatively a factual claim, that is what one challenges. And so if EPA were to actually follow Harry's slide and make the claims that CO2 is responsible for these 12 things, then each one of those would be subject to challenge. There would have to be a reasonable basis for its conclusion on each of those 12 things. If EPA says nothing about the subject, you don't need to be dealing with it. But the endangerment finding is written in such a broad fashion that you really have to deal with the science or the information in a comprehensive way. I do recommend not doing it in one request for correction, however. I prefer to do it in 100 different requests for correction, each one dealing with a very narrow, specific scientific issue, and not allowing an agency to respond in part and ignore the rest. That is a pattern that agencies have followed for the 15 years that this has been in place.
If you have a compliant and helpful administration, I think you just can tear it down with one. If you've got an administration who does not want to go down that road, I think it's very much like marathon. You know, the only guy left at the end of the battle, you know, ran 26 miles and said we won and then died. And I...
Jerry.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Alan. Oh, I'm sorry. It doesn't matter. We'll get to both of you. Alan.
Okay. Can anything that was written before 2009, when the endangerment finding was issued, be used in a review of what the agency did?
Well, I think, Alan, the way that this would go in a reconsideration of the endangerment finding would be to take the existing record, including your memo, and all the new information. So you use it all. but you use more than importantly the most recent information, for example, that shows that climate sensitivity numbers are far below what we presumed in 2009. So I think you want to use the best argument, and those are new data, tend to be new data.
And if you follow Rick's idea of turning science questions into data quality questions, into process questions, then that's a backward-looking corrective procedure that might create some leverage to use to attack the 2009 information base.
Let me also add that information is disseminated when it's disseminated as long as disseminated. So a document published in 1942 that is currently disseminated is covered. The only thing that would not be covered is a document previously published that has been withdrawn.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, don't forget to mention in your testimony that I believe in submarines, the atmosphere is kept at 1,000 parts per million. So what great harm that does to submariners. Also, I've made an inquiry with the University of Arizona. They're conducting an sealed agricultural experiment for growing food to go to Mars. I bet you it's 1,000 to 2,000 ppm.
Okay, I think that's it. We have to go. Another session starting at 5 o'clock.
Thank you all for letting us speak.
Yes.